Good morning, class. No, how's everybody doing? The power of a microphone, the second you realize you have it, is just, you have to back away and be like, okay, calm down. Everybody feeling good Saturday? This is, FailFest 2016. I failed, it sucked, but here's how I bounced back. And this is actually the third year that we have done a panel like this at ONA. Housekeeping, there's a hashtag, ONA16FailFest. So, and I'm going to start doing a search on that in a second. ONA16FailFest, so that's where you can do the tweets. And so I'm just going to give a brief premise for this, and then we'll hear from all of our esteemed panelists. And then I would love to hear actually from you guys. This is, we can do questions and have a back and forth, and we might even have questions for each other. But we might have questions for you guys, and we might want to, if you have stories as well, I think we would want to hear those as well. So let me start by giving the premise here, which is, I think certainly in our sort of new digital age of journalism, we as an industry have embraced the idea that failure can be a good and positive thing. And that's, I think, a very good thing because it happens, right? It's just sort of a professional hazard, I would say, of sorts that people are going to work on projects that fail, some big, some small, everything in between. And so it's good that we have this, we've adopted this sort of, some would say Silicon Valley mantra of, fail fast and embrace the failures, et cetera. But what we don't talk about at the same time is the underbelly of that, which is that even if we as an industry cheer it, as an individual, it still sucks. It can be really painful, right? Like and there's all kinds of, I think, stages of that, right? There's curling up in a ball, there's, anger, grieving, acceptance, and the various stages of accepting kind of what happened. And I think it's important that we also as an industry, or I would say community, is maybe a better word, talk about that and be open about that feeling with each other because it is something that we all go through. And I think this goes to, the way I look at ONA, there's sort of like, when it comes to networking, I think there's two types of networking. There's professional networking, shaking hands, talking about business, collaborations, et cetera. But there's also what I would call peer networking or community networking. And that's building a network of peers, a network of colleagues whom you trust, whom you develop with over time, who you feel like you can commiserate with. And that's something that I think everybody I'm sure is familiar with on an individual level. And this is a strange attempt to do that at a little bit more scale. The goal is not to be too much on a high horse here, but I think it's important that we acknowledge that element of our careers and our our paths, and I think it crystallizes in moments of failure and how we react to that and how we communicate that and how we hear communication back from that. And by the way, failure here can be, you're going to hear hopefully a variety of different stories of failure, management failure, project failure, company failure, and even just endeavor failure, right? I think failure can be as small as, in some respects a typo. Hopefully that's the kind of thing that we can easily get over to, something more public and massive, et cetera. So hopefully it's a chance for all of us to recognize that it's something that happens to all of us, and we're going to share our stories. It's like real talk. And afterwards, again, we might sort of talk with each other, but I would love to hear from you guys as well. So if you have examples of something similar, again, any kind of variety of failure that you would want to share afterwards in the sort of Q&A, don't hesitate. It's a good feeling to sort of talk about it sometimes. So with that, we didn't come up with an order. I don't know who wants to go first. You'll do it? All right. Julie, take it away.
Good morning. Is this working? Good. It is working, right? Okay. So I know that it's 10 a.m., but I'm actually going to start with a mention of whiskey, so don't judge. Today I'm going to talk about the staffer or boss that you've used up a lot of whiskey on. In my case, specifically bourbon, because I just prefer bourbon. My name is Julie Westfall. I currently work at the LA Times, but I've led multiple breaking and trending news teams charged with innovating and making change in newsrooms, and especially just brand new teams. So teams that haven't existed before and come together to carry out a fairly new mission. And everyone has had to work on teams where, they didn't choose the people they work with, or they inherited their boss, or they inherited their staff or their colleagues. Sometimes you don't get to pick your employee or your boss, and you have to deal with that, good or bad. And sometimes that situation works out just fine. And sometimes, as we say, it doesn't work out, and it's not a good fit, even when sometimes you do get to choose everyone that you work with, and you have to deal with that too. And this can be really, really challenging, especially when you're doing new things and trying to evolve rapidly, as so many of us are in our newsrooms. But regardless of the ultimate outcome of those situations, I definitely could have dealt with that situation going south better in the past. So the failure I'm going to talk about is not dealing as best as I possibly could have with a staffer that might be struggling on a new team. And then, what sucked about that and what I learned from that, which is a lot. I definitely let some particular situations, ride for too long. I was kind of hoping that the general expectations that I set for the new team would sort of organically work for everyone, and that the bumps in the beginning would work themselves out, and sometimes they do. But sometimes it becomes very clear that they're not, and you need to do a 180 or do some reassessing. And I think my failure in the situation that I'm thinking of was just that I let it fester too long, I let it snowball, and that sucked. It sucked for other staffers, who have to deal with the toxicity of a staffer who's working with them, who's not necessarily that happy because they're not in their groove, they're not feeling directed in the right way, and maybe they're not doing what they thought they were going to be doing, because on new teams like this, the expectations can change, the goals can change, and sometimes they're not clear from the beginning, which I'm going to get to later. It also sucks for the staffer because typically in a situation like this, they're not growing. They're not only not happy, but they're not growing in their job. And they, probably are not sure that they're accomplishing, what they set out to do by joining this new team. It sucked for me a lot. I spent a lot of time stressing and strategizing the best way to deal with the situation instead of acting really decisively from the beginning. And it was also bad just for the newsroom overall. The newsroom is looking to these new teams to innovate and make changes in newsrooms, and those teams are also being watched really closely and scrutinized. So when a situation comes up where someone is not fitting into a team, that can have a really cascading effect, for the team's whole mission and then for the newsroom. So what I learned. First, set clear expectations early and often. I have failed to set clear expectations right from the start. When you're building a new team, especially in a legacy organization that already has, a bunch of standards set up for other teams, it is really important, I think, not to just go with the flow, but to set clear expectations right from the start so that people feel, really directed on a new team. And like I referred to before, sometimes I've let that happen just a little bit too organically, even when I recognize that that may not be correct for everyone. So in hindsight, I really needed to provide more of a specific mission and to communicate much, much more about the expectations from the very beginning to help cut off some of those issues at the pass. I've typically, while running these sorts of teams, implemented a defined mission, but with a lot of flexibility. So because I want people to innovate, and I want them to feel comfortable experimenting. But that kind of flexibility doesn't necessarily work for everyone, and you need to figure out how to make it work for the people it might not be working for. Feedback loops and structure are everything. So break out of the daily grind to accommodate them. You cannot learn often enough that staffers are different and respond to different kinds of feedback differently. Everyone's heard this, especially everyone who has read a management book or taken any kind of class about this. Everyone responds to feedback differently and needs different type of feedback in terms of what kind of feedback it is, verbal or written, how often it comes. So do everything that you can to accommodate that and build a regimented feedback loop from the start. So along with the mission, just set up those structures from the start, because people actually crave structure, in fact, and structure is necessary for innovation and change, especially in legacy newsrooms, and I've worked in both kinds. People, complain about meetings a lot, but if you have the right kinds of meetings, people actually really enjoy them, and it's the kind of structure that, at least if they don't happen too often, and they're good meetings, it helps a team be cohesive. It helps certain team members bond with other team members, and helps them understand and internalize, the changing missions of these kinds of innovative teams. And by creating a really good feedback loop from the beginning, you're going to help your team also develop each other. And if you're a staffer on a team, you're not a manager, this asking for a better feedback loop or asking for more situations where you can bond with your teammates will help you to not only develop yourself, but create the environment for everyone to be able to learn from each other. Learn how to have difficult conversations. If you're not a manager, learn how to do this with your boss too. People generally aren't born knowing how to do this. Some people learn it on the job. Some people get formal training to do this, and if you think that would help you, I would definitely recommend it. This is where I'm going to plug programs like the Women's Leadership Academy, which is run by ONA and Pointer, and which I did this year and was really helpful for me. Human resources exist for a reason and not just for dealing with a problem. So this is the final thing I learned, close to the final thing I learned. I learned over time that I really wish that I had from the beginning, I've worked at multiple companies, from the beginning really connected with HR and learn their processes, not just for managing a problem, but for getting help from them on how to be a good staffer or a good manager in that company. Like what resources they have to help me learn. Sometimes, HR feels like too formal or possibly not that helpful, but I've actually found it really helpful when I've needed them, and in hindsight, wish that I had connected with them very early on and established a relationship with them so that I could go there for support if I needed it. And then the final thing I learned is that bourbon is delicious, but it's not a solution. Thank you.
Thank you. It's funny, I had a similar experience one time in HR. It's like the rebel part of me didn't want to go to HR, but it ended up, I should have, the same thing, should have gone sooner. I interjected only because I wanted to point out one thing, which is that the general gist, I should have mentioned this earlier, is like kind of an explaining of what the failure is, what it felt like at the time, and then kind of what we learned or how we feel in it in hindsight, and hindsight being, I think, where we take things away from it. So again, when we open it up to you guys, think of structuring it in that same way, just so that we kind of, I want to make sure that if we do start sharing that everybody kind of has enough space. So think about that format of like, what was it, how did it feel at the moment, and then how does it feel, or how do I think about it in hindsight? And I also failed. I forgot to use my opening joke, which is too late now, because it was going to be like, oh, if this fails, then we'll have something to talk about next year. Wah, wah. I'm a dad. It's a dad joke. It's a dad joke. All right.
So good. Me?
Anybody? No.
I'm going to the podium. I've decided. Hey guys, thanks for coming. Son. I'm Corey Hike. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of Mike. And I think I'm sort of a last-minute add to this panel. No, not really. I think I sort of was. But when I heard about it, like, hey, there's this panel on failing, and I'm like, cool, I don't know about that. I was like, I like to talk about all the winning pieces. But actually, Mike is a culture where that's really embraced, and something that I was at the Post, Washington Post, before coming to Mike, and something that we really worked on there, and this idea is this heavily felt at Mike, is this always in beta kind of culture, which is an awesome one. So failure is very much embraced, but the idea is like move fast, what did you learn from it? Pivot, iterate, that kind of thing, and keep going. And it's one thing to walk that walk. No, it's one thing to talk that talk, but it's another to walk that walk. And my experience at the Post and then at Mike, it's very similar in that fashion. So it feels good. So actually, I was like, yes, I'm going to do this panel. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. So I've been at Mike for 9 months. It's a really fast 9 months. It's like a long time in startup years, actually. And we've done a lot of things this year that I feel really, really good about. You guys remember, like, early, like Q1, like the biggest thing for Facebook was live and bots, Messenger, right? Do you guys all like shake your head? Do you remember this? It was like right. It was like going to change the world. Is there anybody here from Facebook?
Good. No.
Cool. I mean, it's great, and I know you're all tweeting, and that's fine. But I want to have a pretty honest conversation about how it went. We're going to talk about Messenger, not live. So the way the teams work at Mike, which is a lot of fun, and the groups that I work a lot with and run, there's a product and engineering team, there's an analytics team, and the editorial team that all sort of works together in this nice alchemy on product pieces. And they're very tight and they're very fast, and they each play a really important role. And so in the case of Messenger, everyone was very, very excited about the idea that Messenger was going to be really, really big. And in fact, it was prioritized by Facebook in that way. At F8, there was a huge announcement around Messenger. It was highly anticipated. And so the crew at Mike, we did everything that we could to actually have something built ahead of F8 because we were certain that it was going to be announced there in some major way. And we did. We had a bot stood up for Messenger and ready to go ahead of the conference, and that was exciting. There were only a handful of publishers that did. The thing about the teams at Mike is they're small, but they're really, really fast when you prioritize something. So got it done. And we thought a bit about what we were going to do on Messenger, but it's a whole new world. I mean, bots were sort of coming into their own, and I can talk a lot about that, and we've had a lot of success on bots, actually, outside of Messenger. But so really excited. Messenger was going to be the big bot push, right? It's got the weight of Facebook behind it. And, the more we sort of dug into it, it felt like, what's the right opportunity on Messenger for news? I think that, and that's how teams at Mike think, and that's how I think a lot of you guys in this room think as part of O&A. You're smart. You're like, okay, what should we do on this platform? Not one size fits all. How do we just take some structured data and throw it into like another format and see if that works? We wanted to be more deliberate about it, but the more and more we thought about it, we're like, this feels like we're kind of using it like push, like we know it's not quite right. That sort of one-way broadcast, like that can't be the best use of it. And then you start to understand maybe what some e-commerce companies are doing, and you're like, such a smart opportunity for retail, that interactivity. I mean, we've all been chatting live, like with like AT&T, and when you're booking vacation, like little chat bubbles pop up, and you like talk through AI, and then a real person. You can see something like that porting over to Messenger, but for news, it's like, But we rushed to get something ready because it was an important deadline, and we felt like, okay about it. And then like the big announcement comes out and like bots for everybody and Messenger is going to change the game. And so we said, you know what? Let's take a little more time with this one. And at Mike, the teams usually work in sort of like a SWAT team fashion. We put together groups that are working really hard on something. And this crew was very much like method acting on Messenger, like what does that platform need? And came up with something pretty cool. It was this caption contest, which I know you might think sounds lame, but hey guys, this one was cool. So it was. And if you're familiar with Mike and the voice of Mike, kind of flips news on its head, upside down, sort of flips the script, as to, so to speak. And so the caption contest was sort of fashioned like that. And the idea is that we wanted to engage the audience in some way. So send out a very relevant news photo from that day, and actually tell folks what the cut line or the caption was, and then ask them to come up with something that felt more like our voice or maybe what it should be. Mike's all about, like, POV is like very like underrepresented story, sort of that intersection of race, class, gender, politics, policy. It's an interesting mix and lens, and our audience it's a community there that's really sort of into that approach to news, and so we knew that if we can start to engage our audiences with that we would have at least some kind of a community that would engage daily. And it was fun, and we got some good responses. And we actually dedicated an editorial crew to producing this every single day. You've got to select a photo. You've got to, produce it through this little CMS that we built through Slack because Slack, and that's kind of cool. Like, I felt good about the product choices and builds that we made along the way. Like, felt very innovative. So it was the lowest friction way to produce this bot every day, but it needed an editor on it. So it actually took resources. And then by week 4, week 5, word would start to bubble up to me, how long, do we need to do this Messenger thing? We kind of have 5 people responding every day. Feels like a high production for what's the ROI? And as far as I could really understand, in order to get folks to sign up for Messenger, there's a couple of promotional opportunities within Facebook, but it's guys, there's an algorithm between you and your audience, that's the truth of it on that front. And so unless you have some big, the home row promotion, it's hard to get that direct connection to your audience and build that. So we had less than 100 folks engaging with it daily. And it was to do a thoughtful editorial production of it every day, took, at least an hour or so. And of all the other priorities that we had, we said, you know what, we think Messenger's really cool, but we made a mistake on going so hard on it from a custom perspective. Maybe we should have found a more automated way to do this one. Meanwhile, our Kik subscription, we have 2 Kik bots. One has over 1 million fans. It's crazy. Banana pants. It's just and this engagement on one of them, it's called, I always sound really ridiculous when I say it, Dis or Dat bot is the name of it. So look it up, Dis or Dat on Kik, and we also have Trump Chat on Kik. And then in Trump Chat and Dis or Dat, combined, they have upwards of 20 interactions per session for when users come in. That's a very meaningful amount of engagement time. So we were seeing that start to track, and we're you know what? We should put resources on that. Anyway, we've made the decision to pivot Messenger to something else. We tried SMS, and I was you know what? SMS, it's going to be the thing. I don't know if you guys saw that we did some SMS stuff around a couple of speeches, and we're going to use it again for debates coming up. And that was cool. But what we also found is SMS, to scale SMS, it's really, really expensive. I don't know, $25,000 expense. It's an expensive proposition if you want to scale that in a big way, which is what we're looking to do. So we've actually moved into heavily focus on our iOS app, which we're working on, rebuilding, and that's an exciting owned and operated proposition. And of course, you have the challenges of, if you're going to get that featured in some way, or how do you convert people to an app product, but the push within that environment, what we found is that Mike is really, really good and fast at push, and we're better to put our editorial resources on that and to build out our owned and operated on iOS. And so more to come on that. But sorry, it was a nonlinear way of describing everything, but there was really this sort of decision point along the way, you know what? Feels like Messenger, we spun up a lot of energy around it. We got excited. We put some promotional power behind it, on the sort of PR marketing side. It was important to us. I cared a lot about it from a platform perspective and partnership relationship perspective. At the end of the day, we're you know what? It's not the right thing. ROI, I don't think it's not going to burn down servers, but also I'm not sure the journalism that we're doing is that crucial. If it were, we'd figure out a way to do it differently. Pivot to SMS, like that's probably not going to scale, focusing on iOS and our own app. So anyway, that's the story of Messenger. So that's I don't know, it's not a fail, it's very much an always in beta kind of thing. So I feel good about where we're landing, and we'll see how our app goes. So that's my story. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Ben, do you want to go?
Yeah. Hi, so I'm Ben Kramer. I'm a journalism technologist. I've been working with drones and 360 video and VR. And I was most recently the beta fellow for the BuzzFeed Open Lab in San Francisco. So I was the first fellow to help get things going. And one of the, I guess sort of, in trying to interface our projects with the newsroom, things didn't always work quite like we had hoped, and so we kind of, or I coined this phrase that we wrote in Sharp, or not in Sharpie, but with a dry erase marker on our glass door, which said, BuzzFeed Open Lab, this might not work. And that's really been sort of the theme of the work that I've been doing over the years. But the funny thing is, when I got invited to be on this panel, my first reaction was, I've never failed. But this is important because I had to think about it. Because failure in the work that I do in working with these emerging technologies is not only inevitable, but it happens all of the time. And so really it's if anything, when I fail, when something goes wrong, it's a sign of progress. Because it just means, well, there's a problem, we'll fix it, and we'll move on. So really failure isn't something that I think about ever, unless, and this is also sort of a Silicon Valley, I guess, thought about what failure is, which is that failure is when you miss an opportunity. And so it's not, whether or not something works or doesn't work, but if you miss out and maybe you see somebody else who's executed an idea and they've got it working and you thought, oh, I had that idea, but I didn't do it. That's failure. That's the most, for me, that's what really kind of hurts the most. But the story that I'll tell, actually there's two short stories. The first is with drones, and it happened 3 years ago, and it's kind of a perfect example of what can happen when working with an emerging piece of technology. And it's a favorite story of Matt Waite, because at the time I was a student, this was 2013, very early on in drones, and the technology wasn't that great. And I was working on a project right on the border of Nebraska and Wyoming. And I was working on a project about the Platte River basin. And so I was flying a very early open source drone across the Platte River. And everything was going great. I was getting these beautiful shots flying over the Platte. I mean, literally right on the state line. And all of a sudden, the drone just started slowly descending towards the water, and I couldn't stop it. And so I just kind of stood there in shock as my, $1,500 aircraft just disappeared under the water. And I just kind of freaked out, silently, but I freaked out. And I shortly after called Matt back in Lincoln at the University of Nebraska. And the phone call went like this: Matt, it's gone. and he's like, what's gone? I said, the drone. And so I felt terrible because it was the first day of a week-long project. My only drone was gone. I felt like dead weight at this point. But that's what happens sometimes when you're working with hardware, emerging technologies, is things just go way wrong, and it's inevitable. Another failure that actually happened, well, this is kind of a failure. This is where failure and emerging technologies, there's kind of this gray area where I did a project at BuzzFeed. I did a lot of 360 video work at BuzzFeed, getting them started in 360 a year ago. And one of the experiments was with a helmet that had a 360, basically it was a 360 video helmet with a camera on the front and the back, and you would stitch the two together, and you would have this kind of first-person view, immersive 360 experience. But there were some problems with the helmet where basically if you've worked with 360 video, you can get blind spots between the cameras. And the way this helmet worked, your head, the wearer's head disappears from the shot because of how the cameras are arranged. So it's kind of cool. It's like you can inhabit somebody else's body when you watch the video. And you can find the video. I published a video on BuzzFeed where we took it skydiving, basically. And you can go to Ben Kramer. If you search for Ben Kramer 360 video on Facebook, you'll find all these videos, including the skydiving video. But anyway, published the video knowing that there were problems with it in a way. The story was kind of fun, you had this first-person skydiving experience, but when you watch the video, technically, there were some issues, and the issues were because of these blind spots, the body of the skydiver who wore it was kind of cut in a weird way. So it's like, at times, just his shoulders would just kind of end, and because he dived in a formation, the divers around him, their bodies would be kind of cut in these weird ways. And so I shared this video on a 360 group on Facebook, and it got thrashed. People were saying, I can't believe you published this. The stitching is terrible. And so I felt like I knew what they were saying, but so that there were those comments, but then there were also people who were actually defending the work, saying, no, what he's doing is, it's new, it's an interesting idea, yes, it needs work, but it's worth, the end result is worth publishing to share this concept, because you have to start somewhere. And I feel like it was sort of a reminder that sometimes something might seem like a failure, and in some people's eyes and some perspectives it might be, perhaps from a technical angle, but from another perspective, it could be a great success because you tried something. Maybe it's not perfect, but nothing's ever perfect the first time you try an idea, especially when working with emerging tools. So it was sort of this weird failure success. And within BuzzFeed, that helmet was what people in BuzzFeed Motion Pictures and BuzzFeed News Video, that's what they were most excited about, was the potential for this kind of 360 video experience with the helmet. So yeah, the first version didn't look that great, but there's a lot of potential there. And so it was a weird kind of failure success.
It's okay, you guys can clap. I feel like there was like half of it. Oh, you got a slow clap. That counts as a slow clap. That's the second year in a row we've had a spontaneous slow clap at FailFest. My name is David Cohen. Again, I want to thank you guys for sharing these stories, and if you guys share your stories as well, because at conferences, and I think it's natural that we are ready to sort of pump up our work, and we should be proud of our work, but I don't think we should ever feel so distant from each other that we can't, again, just sort of talk about things that genuinely happen and sometimes genuinely suck. And I've been through my share. I'm going to share maybe one sort of like flash snippet from my experience at Circa. It's more like a scene, and then I'll also go back to a startup that I did before that called Spot Us. Circa was a mobile. It's actually still around, but Circa that I was involved with was a mobile phone news app. And it sort of focused on breaking news, and how it was cool. I had a lot of fun working on it, and it was very much sort of in the tech startup world. I think our initial audience were sort of what you'd call tech early adopters. It was funded, it had funding from Ben Huff, from I Candace Cheeseburger, and David Karp, and so we sort of ramped up to this big launch day, right? It was truly one of those. Ideally you can do. We had beta testing and things like that, but ideally when you launch, it's because you've polished some things and are ready to launch. And we felt like we were, felt being the operative word. The day that we launched, that morning, skipping technical jargon, the quick way of explaining it is the servers were getting fried. A kind of call that had been tested on a small scale and was working fine. Once it was being used by lots of people, slowed down everything. Like the app would take 3 minutes to load, which means it didn't load for anybody, right? Because no one's going to wait 3 minutes. And we immediately started getting, complaints. This is supposed to be a big launch. We had press, so a lot of coverage coming, and these are, sort of the first impression that you want to give, right? And we were essentially sucking. And even the back end, the CMS that all the editors had been using for a couple months maybe to write everything had slowed down as a result as well. Like the editorial team was literally just tied with our hands behind our backs, and the tweets and Facebook and everything started coming in of "you suck," what a disaster, just all the things started coming in. And actually, I'm going to give credit to Matt Galligan, the CEO, because there was one moment internally where, at one point, we were trying to diagnose the problem. Again, the technical team was, and at one point there was sort of like a finger being pointed, and Matt stepped in. He was like, "We're not going to do that right now. We'll talk about that later. Let's just, everybody try and figure out what we can do now," which changed the entire tenor in the room. Because I think, from the first finger being pointed, in my mind, I could easily see that, spinning out of control. But stopping that, we still had, obviously, a big problem on our hands, which is that, here we are, we raised a bunch of money, we're doing this big launch, and essentially our product is just there to get made fun of at this moment. Not made fun of, but certainly not satisfying anybody. So immediately the editorial team became customer service. Like we immediately became full customer service representatives, essentially. We responded to every tweet to the point where we actually maxed out the Twitter API. They said that we couldn't send anymore, so we called up Twitter, explained it to them. They allowed us to continue to tweet every single person, be like, "Hey, it's going to come up. Don't worry, don't worry." And on the tech side, they did essentially this hack that took away some functionality, some of the initial functionality, the parts that were, again, doing this call that was burning all the servers. And even then, the back end was still super slow. It would still take, several minutes to save things. And so for the first 3 weeks of Circa, and this is during the 2012 presidential, I think it was 2012 presidential, leading up, so it was like, it was 2011, like this time, 2011, the debates were going on, and it would take, we were trying to cover live the debates, but it would take several, minutes to save things. So it was just, I remember me and the CTO were up until 4 a.m. just trying to get shit out, and it was just a really miserable 3 weeks. And at the end of it, almost wanted to rage quit. We got through it, and again, I think that moment of not pointing fingers was one of the defining things. But as far as failure goes, it was certainly there was no way, in some respects, to ever. You can only launch like that once, right? There was no going back and saying, "Okay, we're ready now. Let's do it over." And so we really had to make up a lot of that. And so not that ever defined Circa in any way, right? We moved on. But, for the first, 3-4 months even, that's the kind of thing that stays with you of oh man, you're constantly going back and think of all the, the bad first impressions. And we as a team and as a startup, I think, had to sort of psychologically get over that. And we did. And I think we, felt really good about our product once it was fully working and pushed forward. And I think a lot of people ended up having a good experience. And what we learned, of course, is that even if, you can never stop making a first impression, right? There was a certain group of people that saw it that first time. They came back. We got opportunity to see them second time, and you slowly do win people back. And we sort of had to just mentally sort of be okay with that first experience, that first day launch, and realize that actually wasn't going to be a make or break moment. There was always moments ahead of us that we could go through. The other thing that I guess I wanted to share, only because I have even more distance from it, and I find that when it comes to failures, the more distant, the way I think about different moments changes based on my distance to it. So I ran something called Spot Us, which was a Kickstarter for journalism, basically. This is in 2000. This is a while ago now, 2008. And in fact, I was, I was maybe even younger than Ben. I think I was 24 at the time when, Alberto from the Knight Foundation called me up and he told me, "David Cohn, you got this grant, And I was immediately scared shitless. One, because he has a very intimidating voice, and two, because I I'd been thinking about this, and it's like I had this idea to do this project, and now I had the means to do it, and I was like, oh, fuck, now I actually have to do this? You know, and I think that there are moments, I call them spidey sense moments, and I've had them in different projects, where you kind of get the sense of like, you know, you get a sense of all the things that can go wrong, right? And funny enough, my story of failure with Spot Us I shared sort of both Circa and this, because the Circa story I just shared is like a specific moment. Spot Us, because I have so much distance, those flash moments, those specifics are almost kind of past me now, and I look at the project in total. So I ran it for about 4 years, and eventually it was acquired by American Public Media, I think in 2011, and they actually just shut it down in 2015. Although, if I'm honest, between 2011, around there, I think 2012, shortly after that, is really when the project ended. I don't think American Public Media ever did anything with it. And so when I look back at it as a quote-unquote failure, one, I learned what you might call a failed merger and acquisition, at least from my perspective, right? I mean, I'm not, you know, and in truth, I take the brunt of that, or I take the blame of it. And it might have been, again, this is, you know, distance, almost 10 years of, at a certain point, I think I may have been burnt out, and I let like a former version of myself down, right? Like, when Spot Us, you have to put it in perspective. Spot Us, startup, nonprofit. That's 2 strikes, right? And you know, and another strike, and this is on me as well. At our height, I think we were 3 or 4 people, and some of them were part-time, and so never was able to build within it a large enough sense of, and I'm talking about within a company, shared responsibility. I became a funnel, essentially, too much so, right? That like everything was kind of, I was the thing that was stuffing up the clogs and the growth. And in truth, I thought of American Public Media or you know, that as a way out for me as opposed to a way forward for Spot Us. I wanted it to be a way forward for Spot Us, but you know, when I look back at it in hindsight as well, I sort of think maybe that was me sort of like throwing up my hands and being like, well, I've done as much as I can, somebody else should do it. And I think I waited too long, really. I think I needed to do something like that earlier when there was more momentum. You know, and that's for any startup, right? There's like periods of momentum and sloth and momentum. And I think in retrospect, looking at it, it's just about decisions and being sort of acutely aware of what's happening. And, you know, that's a really hard thing to do in any moment, right? So I don't even, when I talk about this as a failure, I don't say, oh man, I must be some fucking idiot, right? I think, I genuinely believe, like, I can imagine anybody, any smart person being in the same circumstances and trying to manipulate certain things, right? There's so much of it is about the decisions you make, but so much of it is out of your control, right? It's the marketplace at the time, it's your positioning, it's again, startup, nonprofit, that was, again, 2 strikes. But again, because I have so much distance from it now, and I hope, you know, I'm happy to talk about this and Circa, and I was also something on Assignment Zero, which was headlined as a beautiful failure one time. That was literally a headline written about it. The more distance I get, the more ability I feel I'm able to talk about it and think about it critically in this way. And again, I think it gives me a kind of insight and increases the spidey sense that I referred to. Comic book nerd, I apologize. But it is that spidey sense of like sort of being aware, again, of these circumstances around me and the positions that I'm in that I like to think give me a heads up. You know, same with, like, I won't go into management failure, but I've had that a very similar experience, and like, you know, all the things you were describing, you know, I'm like, oh, like, you know, and now they're almost telltale signs, and it's good to have that because, again, it increases that spidey sense. So I'm gonna stop. I apologize. I talk fast too. I know it. Because I want to again open it up to see if you guys have either questions, it's fine. I mean, you can probe us, but I also want to see if folks have other experiences. Again, failure here can be as everything as large as your own company falling apart, or you know, you know, breaking a piece of hardware. If anybody ever threw their computer thinking it was a drone, but yeah.
It's actually really a question. I'm part of an old line media company, and I think we have a problem admitting failure. So how do you think you lower the stakes? Because I think I really more believe in the philosophy that you're going to fail a lot. It doesn't necessarily matter that much, and that's how you learn. But there are a lot of companies, I think, I've worked at a lot of companies, sadly, you know, where that's actually really hard to do. You guys have any advice?
I can take that. Speaking as a person who's worked in a few legacy media companies on the digital side, I know exactly what you're talking about. There's a lot of risk-adverse mentality. Like, people are nervous to take risks, also admitting failure. I mean, you heard me open it up by saying, I don't like to talk about failing, I like to talk about winning. Always in beta. There's just something about that. Newsrooms are driven by ego and envy. It's a thing. You know, they're like really proud when they do great work, and then you're only as good as your last success, and people want to be successful because other people are successful. There's a lot of that that's just in the DNA of publishing. Some of it works to our advantage, admittedly. We've all heard, like, well, how are we chasing that other story? And it's like, do we have to chase that other story? Like, do we? Maybe they just didn't, and that's okay. Like, do we have to build a product because they built it? Like, maybe that's okay. But there's a lot of that mentality, too. So I think, for me, in these, like, bigger orgs, and then figuring out how you can experiment, you know, one, you can just, like, scorched earth method, where you just, like, you have, like, a team of sort of rogue folks that are ready to just do, like, SWAT team style experimentation, and you gather that group. Like, that's one way. I've definitely done things that way. We're like, oh, I mean, I see Dave Merrill over there from the Washington Post. We're like, we're on a pirate ship. Okay? And, like, there's that approach. It's not always the best one, but I think there's something to that, though, that very scrappy hustle. You got to get the right folks together. And for me, that's an exciting way to work, because it's about, like, okay, what's the cool idea? How do we pick, like, I'll have this person and this person and this person, and put them together and try something. Like, maturing that up a little bit, making that more sophisticated and systematized, I would say, like, all right, figuring out, like, what the right process is for that kind of stuff. It doesn't have to be too formal, but there is something to baking in that kind of structure, which we've certainly done at Mike. The analytics person that I mentioned, that's part of these sort of experimental SWAT teams, that's a key person. That person sort of sets up, like, what is success going to look like, and it's not apples to oranges to I mean, it is apples to oranges to the other project. Like, it's very, like, for this one, like, are we looking at daily active users? Are we looking at time spent? When are we going to know, like, what are the gates that we have to go through? Like, in 2 weeks, if it doesn't do blah, then we need to pivot. So setting up that kind of little experimental process, I think, has been helpful. Did a lot of that at the Post, and then now certainly at Mike. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's how I would approach it.
This question's for David, and the whole panel can answer as well. When you mentioned that you felt like a funnel because everything was being put on you, but only just a little bit of progress was coming out, do you tie any of your failures to lack of rest or lack of a break?
That's actually a really good question, and could be, in my opinion, a whole other, like, real talk panel of, like, I guess self-care might be the word. And, like, I'm looking at Kim. I know, like, we've talked about this again, and so that's a good topic, because, again, networking is also about peer networking, commiserating. Yes, I mean, and this is, now that I'm a little bit, I don't want to say older and wiser, because I don't believe that you can be wise and young as well, but, like, from my experiences, I am better now at understand. I used to have this, I used to joke about it. I used to say, the internet doesn't sleep, and so neither can I, right? And, like, I joked about it, but I almost believed it, like, I was almost like, well, I just have to keep going. And that's a mistake. I think that was a mistake on my part. I think being able to unplug, I know for me, I perform better making sure that I take time to unplug, to do the things I do. And now, if I'm honest as well, I'm older. I got a kid now. It wouldn't be worth it, right? Like, it's about, like, a full life is a full life. And, I mean, we love our jobs. I love my job. It does define me in some way, but it doesn't define everything about me, right? I mean, again, I have a kid. That's very important. So I do think I don't know how to teach that to somebody, because I don't think it's something, I think it's just something everybody has to decide for themselves of, like, where that starts and stops. And what I tell my team now is, I always tell them this: I want 100% from you. I don't want 110. I want whatever is sustainable, right? And I'm not going to tell you what sustainable is. You decide what is sustainable for you, and I trust you to make that decision, and you give me 100% at a sustainable level. But if I see you at 110% burning yourself out, I will actually step in and tell you not to, because then this sounds bad, but as a manager, if I'm selfish, you're no good to me if you're burnt out, right? So I think that is something that, again, I didn't have a team, and so I wasn't able to have that conversation with other people and make that happen for myself, at least with Spot Us. With Circa, it was better. AJ Plus and on, again, I've been much better. And again, that's about open communication with myself and my team, and just making sure that that's a conversation you can have. I didn't have it at Spot Us, and that was a mistake.
I would say real quick, boredom. It's good to have time to be bored so that you can, a lot of ideas that I've had have come out of periods of time where I'm not actively engaging in anything, and it's hard to do that now because I'm always tied in, I'm always connected, but that's one thing that I try to find time to, a state of mind that I try to find sometimes, is just to kind of be bored and to let my mind wander. And I could be anywhere, and I could get an idea for something that's completely unrelated to where I am or whatever mundane thing I happen to be doing. But yeah, boredom is good.
And managing the daily grind, which I mentioned, I think is really important for addressing the problems that I was talking about. If you get too caught up in the daily grind, your brain starts to trick you into thinking, that you don't have time for these other things, and what's right in front of you is the most important thing, and you lose perspective, which is what can lead to the problems I talked about.
Hi, I'm Ben, and I thought I would share two failures. The first is, especially at a conference like this, you really want to look successful, and that's become a real habit to try and make myself look good. But 2 years ago, I quit AJ Plus just before it launched to take a prototype grant to work on a passion project that I'd had since 2008. And 7 months later, I'd run out of money and just gotten denied from Matter.vc, and it crushed me. And so I just wanted to throw out the notion that failure is, we talk about it as a way to move forward, but I think also, there were days that I spent just in bed, and really it took a while to kind of come back. I had to start running. Luckily, some good friends kind of helped pull me out of a funk. But failure is a problem, and it hurts. And so if anyone else is in that, deal with it, be kind to yourself, and soon enough you'll be able to look back at it and learn from it. And the other much more fun failure story that might be more useful. Now I'm working for McClatchy, and just recently we did a VR project for an advertising client that involved strapping 6 GoPros to a 12-foot shopping cart / drag racer. And then taking that product and showing it at Sonoma Raceway during a NASCAR race. And we planned a lot around this thing. It was nothing any of us had ever done before. And the day that we were there to present, we were in the sun and moving through 400 people, putting headsets on their faces and playing the thing for them. It was really going well until about halfway through the day. I noticed that there were yellow spots all over the phones and black spots, and something was happening to the screens, and I didn't know what. And it turned out that the lenses are magnifying glasses, and if they're facing the sun, it's like burning ants. So if you're ever in a similar environment, don't do what I did and cook $1,200 worth of phones.
And can I have a question, Ben? With the first failure, what if you hadn't pursued the passion project? Do you think that you would have felt like you had let yourself down? So you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure. I'm still struggling with that. So in taking the job at McClatchy, before I accepted it, I took 2 weeks to go heads down on the project to make it an LLC, and I still struggle between doing my day job and keeping it up. But yeah, I definitely made the right choice.
I was in on a high-profile failure with Julie, TBD.com, and I think, and this kind of goes to some of the processing things that we've been talking about. I think it was important for, we certainly, had lessons we learned from things that we could have done better, but it was also important to identify what is and isn't a failure. The company didn't give the concept that we all came together to launch a chance to succeed. And so I said repeatedly, you aren't a failure if you didn't get a chance to succeed. It didn't succeed, but when they hired us, the owner told me we had 3 to 5 years to make money, and they're pulling the plug 6 months in. We did have our failures. We did need to learn, but I think it mattered as we were kind of scattering and looking for new jobs to be able to give ourselves credit that TBD wasn't a failure. TBD didn't get a chance to succeed.
Can I just comment on that one thing? Just because, one, Steve, you're amazing, by the way. Because one thing that, and I think about this with both Spadas, Circa, and I've talked about with other people who do startups that go down, that sounds mean, but like, there's something to be said about success as a business, and there's also something to be said about success as a statement to the journalism community. Like TBD was something that everybody looked at and was like, wow, that is a way to do it. And even if TBD went down, I like to think the practices and principles got absorbed by the larger industry, and so it moves the whole industry, right? I mean, and I think about that with Spadas and with Circa. I look at like Reportedly, which could end up still being somewhere, who knows? But even if it doesn't, I still think Reportedly did something that I think all of us can look at and be like, wow, let's learn from the practices and principles. So in that respect, even if I think there's a distinction between a business failure and a theoretical success or a principled success. So I look at TBD in a similar way. I just wanted to put that out there.
Hi. So I have an interesting work experience where I've worked both on the editorial side and now I've transitioned over to the product and technical side of building a media company. And one of the things that has struck me is sort of the worst case scenario involved in failure for both sides of things. For if a technical product fails, you have a post-mortem, everyone kind of comes together, talks about what works and what didn't. If something happens on the editorial side, you need a sacrificial lamb, and usually someone's career ends up falling on a sword. It's very much the difference between, you look at like the British politicians and someone's got to resign for what, like the thing that they said that was wrong. That's very much like the editorial side of things. Like if someone publishes something and they forgot to add the proper quotation marks, like their career is affected by that. Whereas if you spend $20 million on a project and it never launches, everyone comes together and says, oh wow, let's talk about what we did here, and don't worry, you all get to keep your money. So how do we kind of bridge the gap between those two? How can you bring some of the kind of more forgiveness and lessons learned to the editorial side of things? And is it possible to do that? Or is it because it happens in a public-facing way? Does there have to be somebody whose fault it is?
I think I can speak up. I mean, there's different types of editorial failures and also different types of editorial opportunities missed is a phrase that we use a lot. So like the failure of not properly quoting someone, that's pretty roundly a fireable offense in the journalism industry. But the failure in quotes of a missed opportunity of not doing an audience engagement piece with a story that would very obviously warrant an audience engagement piece. I think that's something that a lot of newsrooms are working on and figuring out how to talk to each other about in a productive way, so people don't feel criticized or like failures, and so that we can move forward. And next time we do that story that very obviously needs an audience engagement piece, we plan for it ahead of time. And that's that's culture change, that's communicating, that's having postmortems, The LA Times covered the San Bernardino terrorist attack. We won some prizes for it. We also had a postmortem and talked about, what we did well and really liked and would like to bring into, our next big stories, our next even everyday stories, how we got there, all the stuff that we did work on, a year or 2 years before to bring new processes into the newsroom that allowed us to be a success during that big story, and also opportunities that we missed and things that we might do differently next time. And those are the kinds of conversations you need to have similar to the tech world in order to, not see those things as failures, but opportunities missed and figure out ways to not miss them in the future.
I think we have time for, do we have, yeah, okay. Take us home.
Okay. It's a lot of pressure.
I'm just kidding.
Feels a little bit like an alcoholic and Alahogs meeting. I'm Jessica, and I too have failed. I have a question for the panel. I too am in a traditional media company, and I'm a columnist, and I've been asked to do something very irreverent, is what we call it. I use a lot of humor, and I have a lot of public criticism, personal public criticism. How do you guys deal with that very public display of not necessarily failure, but testing the waters and trying something new?
Sorry.
No, go.
Well, I just want to, are you asking about how to deal with the public criticism, or?
Yeah. How do you deal with very public criticism?
For me, I'll be brief too. For me, it totally depends on the tone and nature of the criticism. Like, I've definitely been like hardcore trolled. Like, there was someone created a Twitter account called The Real Digidave, talking about my grandma and things like that. And like, and when I was younger, again, I have engaged with trolls, and now I don't. If it is a genuine thing, in truth, I try and put on a customer service hat, and it is hard. You have to just swallow it, smile. This is again assuming that there's an assumption of genuine, like a genuine person there that is ready to engage. And then I ingratiate myself. I apologize for missing the mark or something like that. And funny enough, some of my biggest critics end up being your biggest fans. I've seen that many times, if they are, again, genuinely willing to engage. The hard part is, because there is a line, there's this gray zone, and there is a line where it's like not worth engaging because they're not real, or like not really interested in doing anything other than just like spewing stuff, and genuinely interested. And that's, figuring out where that is I think one of the hardest parts. I don't know.
Yeah, well, just quickly, and I agree with what you're saying. I think there's a bright line between, but there's like squishy gray area before you get to that bright line between the trolls. And I think largely, unless there's some nervousness around repercussions, I think there's a session going on right now on doxing. Unless you're into that zone, you sort of have to ignore it. We sign up for this, basically. Like, what we do is public. From like an editorial perspective, like people, you want to provoke conversation, you want to get people interested, and you have an opinion, you expect them to have one back. Like, I think it's okay. I think that's just a healthy tension kind of thing. On the other side of it, we're pretty vigilant about responding to people that write in via email to Mike. I think people tweeting, it's one thing. People responding Facebook comments, it's one thing. We pay attention to them. But there's just something about like someone who took the time to send an email. It's different. They're not trying to shame you publicly. They're not just giving their quick like hot take. They have something to say, and they went to the trouble of figuring out how to email you. There's just a lot of kind of friction for them to get there, and if they get there, then they deserve a response. And a lot of them sometimes are like they're rants, but generally these are people that are vested in Mike in some way. So we respond to them, and it kind of takes up a lot of work, to be honest, like time. But I think it's worth it. So I think pay attention, but know that line. Trolls, no, forget about it. People are going to respond. They're going to have. People will always have something to say. You're probably doing the right thing. Generally, is what it means. That's it.
We're getting it's a wrap sign, but I hope we can continue the conversation in a dispersed way. Thank you all. We love you.